Hello, my name is Jānis Sārts, and I'm Director of NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, and welcome back to the StratCom webinar series. And this time around, we're going to look into the subject of vaccines, vaccination, and disinformation. And we'll try to drill into the idea of what we as a governments, NGOs, and citizens can do to provide as clear and as practical and as science-based information as possible. And there is a story around. A secret global elite run by the sinister Bill Gates has decided to take control of the humankind. And they've devised a very sinister plan, and that is to create a virus, a deadly virus that spreads around the globe, and then under that pretext create a vaccine that is not really a vaccine, that is a chipping element that would introduce the microchips in all the humans with only one purpose, to take control of a human race, to finally have it, to reduce the numbers of people living, to have their bidding in every way and form, and to finally have the global domination. Well, sounds familiar, doesn't it? We've seen these conspiracy theories quite a lot in recent years. And actually, it's the easiest way to address that is to make fun of them, because you would wonder how people come to these conclusions, how they come to the idea that that might be possibly true. But when we look at today's situation with the pandemic, we see that in fact so many people are buying into some sorts of these conspiracy theories. And if I look at the very recent publication from the GlobSec on the GlobSec trends, we see that in the Central Europe and Western Balkans region, in fact, 24% of the population do believe that vaccine is a tool to implant nanochips and control people. So, however we would look at this particular conspiracy theory, somewhere there are 24% believing in that. And of course there are much more people believing, like 34%, that COVID-19 is fake to manipulate the population in the world. And that is all happening against the reality of 1 year into the global pandemic, almost 1 year of global pandemic. Hospitals in Europe, in United States and Canada, struggling with providing services, with having beds for those who are sick with this deadly virus. Society has become much more divided. The inequalities are growing. Schools have been struggling, and we are yet to understand what would be the outcome of school children not having a proper education for almost a year. And when we look at science and scientists, they say the only feasible way out is vaccination. And yet, we have so many people still being wary of vaccines, believing in conspiracy theories. Data from Eurobarometer from December last year shows that in Europe, the total of roughly half of the population is ready to take the vaccine in 2021. And in some countries, it's just barely the third. And that is obviously an issue when we see the toll the pandemic has on the society, on people, on psychology, economy, on the medical system. At the same time, the only feasible way out is highly disputed. So that's the crossroads we're having. We're having vaccines now getting more and more available throughout Europe, throughout the world. And at the same time, more and more countries are facing the question how to talk to people, how to tell them about vaccines, and how to fight disinformation, both created by different groups, but also state actors, but also by the societies themselves and different groups within the societies. To untangle that difficult question, today we have two very good experts. One is Morgan Olofsson, who is currently Director of Communications at the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency, and before that has been a Director of Communications in the Swedish Red Cross, Swedish Work Environment Authority, and before that has been working at the Swedish television as a head news and a news anchor. Joining him we have John Hassain, a StratCom practitioner consulting across government and commercial organizations with emphasis on security-related communication. And currently, John is working on a project countering hostile vaccine narratives overseas for the UK's National Security Communications team. Welcome to both. And I will start with Morgan. Morgan, you have a particular position now in Sweden to, I think, address some of those issues. And when I look at the data, certainly Sweden is not the most difficult of European nations that had to be addressed. But can you please tell us, walk us through, what have been your approach to fighting this vaccine disinformation, and how to make sure people have access to the correct scientific information? What has been your strategy?
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is a great honor, and I think these webinars is probably one of the most important lessons for all of us, that we need to share knowledge and experience so that we can help each other to improve in the upcoming days, weeks and months that will prove to be very decisive in our struggle with the pandemic. So first, to put you in context, MSB is the Swedish abbreviation for the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, and we are responsible for helping society to prepare for major accidents, crises, and consequences of war. Our work is led by a Director General appointed by the Swedish government, but Swedish authorities are somewhat more independent than may be the case in other European countries. We have approximately 1,000 employees working at different locations in Sweden, and the Swedish government has assigned MSB with a task to identify and counter attempts to influence information campaigns, and also to spread knowledge in this field to other authorities in Sweden. And since 2016, we second a national expert to the NATO StratCom COE in Riga. So, in order to address the problem in the specific question when it comes to communication and vaccine, I think I need to go into the broader perspective when it comes to how we have addressed communication in the big picture when it comes to the pandemic. This broader question, not only does it put us into context within which we operate, but it also presents some of the gaps, or should I call it faults, if you like, that have been and will be and can be exploited by those who might want to influence the information flow, either from a plan, or that these gaps might be filled in a more unplanned fashion with misinformation and rumors. That might be problematic as well. And let me start with what has lately struck me, and that is that there is an underlying narrative that consists of no one would admit to it if asked or challenged, but that all this, almost, at least the gravest of the consequences, could have been avoided if only responsible authorities had taken action in due time. And it seems like that due time is constant. So in every second, there seems to be questioned whether we do the right thing or not. And that is something for us all. And that might have been true if it comes to closing down that market in Wuhan, maybe, or if trade with wild animals in China had been stopped. But once the virus had spread, there was very little that anyone could do in order to stop the spread totally. So after a certain point, it has all been about containing the virus. But the underlying narrative is that this could have been avoided somehow. And given this, there is a huge gap to fill, and which is possible to exploit. And that is the situation we are in the midst of now. And oddly enough, another take on this is that there is now a myriad of narratives from individuals, that is anecdotal evidence. And these human stories might be correct or incorrect, but the thing is that they often wield more power than the more rational explanation that we as authorities normally present. I think, and I hope there will be some questions from our Irish colleagues, but I would like to take an example from Ireland with the vaccine program against HPV there, where the vaccination rate, this is to put into context 11-year-old girls who were supposed to be vaccinated, and it fell drastically from 85% in 2014 to around 55% in 2017. And this happened after some parents came out with stories that their kids had gotten ill from taking the vaccine. Rational arguments did nothing or little to counter this. And it was not until the vaccine program got, amongst other, Laura Brennan, 25, who was dying from cervical cancer and volunteered to campaign for the vaccine with words like, "The vaccine saves lives. It could have saved mine." And in 2019, 70% of 11-year-old girls on Ireland took the vaccine, compared then to 55 2 years earlier. So I address this because it's not only rational arguments that will help us. We need to get into the storytelling. Another gap or fault is created by the fact that it has been difficult to bring in other perspectives aside from the contagion itself. Sweden's 3 national security objectives, and I think you have the comparable ones in your countries. The Swedish ones are decided by government and parliament, and they are 1, life and health; 2, the functioning of society itself; and 3, underlying values like democracy, human rights, and freedom. And I would argue that it has been, at least in Sweden, and from what I take it, having read international newspapers, European and American, it has been hard on all levels to talk about anything but life and health. And I would have to state that that is the most important thing. But when presenting not only one argument for why you should wash your hands or take the shot, the vaccine, it is more likely, with more arguments, more perspectives, that it will lead to behavioral change. For instance, we can see younger people who are not really bothering to follow recommendations that are put up. They know that the risk that they will get seriously ill is slim. A stronger argument for them might be that they should take the shot for their granny. Or that might not be enough either. Maybe they should take the shot in order to get back to the classroom, or in order to get that long sought after job, or even for their friends to get a chance at that internship at a bank. The more arguments of different perspectives, the less gaps or faults are there to be exploited or just to present themselves as fertile ground for rumors. The vaccination communication strategy in Sweden is a responsibility for the Public Health Agency of Sweden, whose chief epidemiologist, Anders Tegnell, might be known to you. The strategy is, of course, written in cooperation with us at MSB and other actors. Its core purpose is to see to it that everyone protects himself and others. And there is, of course, a challenge that we would like to communicate in a very clear way and be sure about what it is at hand. And given that science, especially when it comes to a new virus, is ever changing, this makes assertiveness impossible. Instead, we have to be open with the uncertainties. Otherwise, they might be exploited, and fast, we need to get out new information. So, to the foreign powers that might attempt at influencing in this pandemic, in Sweden so far, it has been on a low level. It has rather been domestic misinformation and rumors that have affected our attempts to reach out to our target audiences. This domestic challenge is often just worried citizens, and the response to them must be very different from what could have been the case if it had been from a foreign adversary. We usually say that if it comes from outside our borders, it's a threat. From inside, it's a vulnerability, and this is a vulnerability and has been taken care in that manner. In Sweden, which might be somewhat different from other places, trust in institutions are high. We can't force or even pressure people too much because it might work in the opposite way. For us, it is important to get the right information out to our target audience. And I would strongly argue, in order not only to get it out, but into their brains in order to change behavior. The vaccination program becomes here a new project that will go on for a long time, and that will lead us even into more territories where we will be more exposed to disinformation. And in that sense, it is almost like putting up the security around the convoy that we are heading into the future to do. So to conclude, we need to see this in broad perspective. It's not only life and health, and we do that in order to protect life and health. We need to use not only rational arguments, but also storytelling. And we need to see that it is not only about threats, but also about vulnerabilities. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to all your questions.
Well, thank you, Morgan. Very interesting, and I think, at least from my part, I would agree to much what you've said. And certainly what resonates with me is the worst way around going about this is by pressuring people, at least in Europe. That's not the way to go forward. We have to make people understand and convince them rather than pressure them into certain positions. And also what I think strikes with me is that idea of having a human factor. So these anecdotal stories from, my kid got sick because of vaccine have so much power, but so much power also has the other part of the story is I saved my granny because I got vaccinated. And I think that's also very important. But I think I would like to push you a little bit on one very clear, so to say, disparity between what we have to communicate based on facts and science and what those creating misinformation and disinformation try to communicate. And that's what we have with the pandemic, vaccine and virus is uncertainty. Because it's new, science is good, but it cannot be that fast. There are many unknowns. Yet, on the other part of a story, everything is known. There's been a plan all along. So there is this, how do you factor into your strategy the idea that you have to communicate uncertainty while the other party is all about certainty? There's no notion of uncertainty, and I think it kind of creates a little bit of, not a little bit, but quite a bit of a disbalance. How to address that?
Well, it is a $10,000 question. I'm always quoting Donald Rumsfeld, if you remember, the unknown unknowns, which are the most difficult. But what you present here are actually the known unknowns, and they should not be that difficult to handle. I think we have to be persistent, and I think this is a time also, considering the fact that should we even say that Enlightenment itself, that almost 300-year-old story, the trust in science is sort of like on the brink here. We need to be open about what science is, and that science never can present a clear answer. Science is merely a road, much like democracy. Democracy is not utopia. It's a road that is going on and will go on forever. Our problem today is that many people would like to have utopia, the simple answer that will create the perfect world. And I think we are somewhat sometimes entangled into that, and we try as Democrats as well to present that vision, and I think that might lead us wrong. I'm sorry to make that question so much broader, but I think this is a time where we need to put things straight. Science is science, and it is a constant road into the future, much like democracy.
Yes, and it requires a very well-educated and independently thinking individual, doesn't it? Now, over to John. Morgan just mentioned that much of what we see is misinformation that is driving the different kind of conspiracy theories and rumors about the vaccination problems and the real kind of imagined realities behind that. But certainly there are more organized actors and that are using this environment for their advantage. And I understand you've been looking at some of these actors and you have some interesting perspectives. So, do we have, and at what extent, and what would be your take on the real interest of these organized actors to push for the disinformation in this? Because on the other side, kind of, it's a humanity problem. but yet some I see are trying to exploit it. John, your take?
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for allowing me this platform to share with Morgan. It's an absolute privilege. And just as a quick reminder, I sit in the National Security Comms team based in the Cabinet Office, London, and I'm one of many people working towards our response to hostile vaccine narratives that come from overseas. So I'll give a little background, and that will allow me to answer your question more directly in terms of what initiated this work. Well, it was October last year, I believe, that the Times newspaper exposed a disinformation campaign that was of Russian origin. And the campaign was claiming that because the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine used a modified chimpanzee virus, it could therefore turn recipients of the vaccine into monkeys. So, although that sort of showed a worrying sort of trend that the perpetrators didn't know the difference between a chimpanzee and a monkey, what they certainly did know was how to create an integrated disinformation campaign. So various channels were used, and there was an excellent selection of memes, so the Prime Minister turning into a monkey because he's taking the vaccine, etc. All promoted in a sort of semi-coordinated way via state-linked media outlets. The head of the Russian Direct Investment Funds and Kremlin spokespeople all used the term monkey vaccine in briefings, so it was out there. I think as an aside, the Russian Direct Investment Fund is actually responsible for marketing the Russian Sputnik vaccine. So as I progress through my talk, I'll let you decide if that's relevant. But I suppose the main point here is that this is not an internal problem. This is something from outside. It was not a lone anti-vaxxer. This is a coordinated, deliberate campaign. And when we were exploring it, the first thing we tried to understand, well, actually, what was the rationale? Why did they do this? And I think the most likely assessment is about the desire to sell vaccines, especially why AstraZeneca in particular was the chosen focus of this attack. Because if you look at it, AstraZeneca is probably the closest comparable competitor to Russia's Sputnik 5 vaccine. They both have very similar cold chains in the sense that they can be stored in a fridge, a regular fridge. They're in a similar price bracket in terms of AstraZeneca's $4 or less per dose. I think Sputnik 5 is somewhere in the order of less than $10. And if you compare that to other brands such as Pfizer, that can be $20 a dose, and there's a very complicated cold chain, so it has to be stored at -60. So they're different choices. And so the low cost and simple cold chain make both Sputnik and AstraZeneca appealing to middle and low income countries. And what's interesting was evidence suggesting that the Russian campaign was actually directed towards those countries where Russia was seeking to sell its own Sputnik vaccine. So predominantly South America or Southeast Asia, we noticed particular trends. And then we sort of had a very interesting turn. So in December, AstraZeneca and Sputnik, the creators of the Sputnik vaccine, signed a partnership agreement to explore using their vaccines together. So sort of mixing doses to increase vaccine efficacy, and that research is ongoing. Russian media then performed what you'd say is a sentiment U-turn on AstraZeneca. I think it's the right way to put it. So prior to this partnership, coverage was either neutral or negative. After the partnership, coverage on AstraZeneca from Russian outlets was predominantly neutral or positive. So very much a U-turn. That isn't to say that hostile narratives towards Western vaccines ceased. It certainly wasn't. It was directed elsewhere, I think is the right way to describe it. But there was nuance here. So as an example, Pfizer, when that was being trialed, some people had allergic reactions to it. Now, these allergic reactions were certainly not significant enough to sway established medical opinion on their safety, but regardless, those events were then sensationalized or promoted beyond their station by Russian media. So not always doctrinal disinformation, but I think you could argue it's sort of hyper-partisan journalism. And so what we saw unfolding was a zero-sum game of vaccine diplomacy, where some states are seeking to maximize the political or reputational dividend or gain of being a vaccine leader, but by undermining rivals. So in simple terms, if they can make this vaccine look bad, it makes their own vaccine look proportionally better. So it's almost as simple as that in some aspects. But regardless of the rationale, the consequences of the disinformation are still quite serious. So attacking the credibility of one vaccine in such a manner risks undermining trust in all vaccines. Mistrust spreads. So that can increase vaccine hesitancy, so the people being reluctant to take vaccines, and therefore prolong the crisis. So that was sort of the preamble of what we observed and what the risks are. So what's our strategy? Well, I suspect our strategy, or the way we break down the problem, is going to be sounding quite familiar to most comms practitioners because we're looking at it in terms of 3 strands of activity that focus on the actor, the environment, and the audience. So specifically, if I talk about the disinformation actor, what is motivating them to actually push this disinformation out? And what levers could we use to persuade or encourage them to change that behavior? An example could be to expose the activity, such as the Times article, which sort of impose a degree of reputational cost and hopefully reduce the chance of such an event happening again. We will see. In terms of the environment, we're talking about the information environment, so how this disinformation actually propagates from actor to audience. So how can we better engage with social media platforms to remove false content and in a sort of timely manner? How can we sort of reduce that time from us identifying some piece of disinformation we think poses a risk and is verifiably disinformation to social media platforms removing it, and so to stop the spread? How can we brief journalists, influencers, civil society groups that are talking about this topic? I think sometimes we underestimate just what a complex issue vaccines is. It's a very complicated issue, and we can't always assume that people have sufficient baseline knowledge to actually scrutinize sources properly before they either write an article on it or a blog, etc., or spread the message further. But we can, as a government, potentially convene the experts that can pass on that baseline knowledge to enable them to interrogate information with some rigor. The third element, or the third strand, is about audience. So how can we make our audiences resilient to narratives of disinformation on this subject? The first question I always ask is, are we providing sufficient high quality information in a way that is palatable to our audiences? Because disinformation loves a vacuum. If we don't tell this story, someone else is going to tell it on our behalf. Can we improve our population's sharing behaviors on the subject so it's harder for the disinformation to spread? And I suppose as a practical example I'd give to that would be the Don't Feed the Beast campaign, which is a UK government campaign. And it's a nice example of how we tried to explain to audiences how to interrogate a source before you choose to share it. And it was a mnemonic share. So it's, where does it come from? What is the source of this information? What is the headline? Is it sensationalized to some degree? How do you analyze it? Take a moment and reflect before you share. Has this piece of content been retouched? Are there any errors in it? So share as a mnemonic. But it's just a good way to just encourage people to think before you share. And that had a degree of measurable effect in terms of sharing behaviors in the population. And that is quite useful because it's almost topic agnostic. It would work as well in a vaccine scenario as it would for any other disinformation problem. And the final point then, before I sort of pipe down, is how I approach these things as a practitioner. So often what I try to do is make our existing pro-vaccine communications more resilient to disinformation. And a specific tool for that I quite like using is the UK's Resist counter-disinformation methodology. One aspect of which is to ensure that you are seeking to realise your own communications goals as opposed to purely countering disinformation. And I think that sounds obvious, but I have been myself in that situation when you're so focused on counter-disinformation, you can almost fall into a defensive mindset and not place enough primacy or effort on actually projecting your own message. So almost a counter-brand approach. So I'll pause and I'll leave it there and pass back to Jānis for any questions.
Well, thank you, John. I think you've described the perfect kind of jungle of information and disinformation just for us. It's not only the anti-vaccination disinformation, but also different vaccines competing with each other and using disinformation to diminish the appeal by one. That of course adds to the cacophony of the information that relates to vaccination, and certainly also increases confusion in the audiences. But I'd like to pick on one of your actually the last point you've mentioned, and that is that of course when we are faced with the disinformation, we have to remember we have to have our own narrative, our story to tell, and not always spend the time or be very careful about spending the time to address publicly or by a strategy disinformation campaign. So in this particular case about the AstraZeneca, what made you think that you have to do something proactively to address that disinformation campaign, and which were the markers that said, well, this one we have to address, while probably some other ones you might have left to feel through and leave it there?
So that's an interesting question in terms of AstraZeneca. So if we look at it and we take a step back, prior to the Times expose, that disinformation campaign was not getting a huge amount of traction. So although the exposure of it by the Times was useful in one aspect, it brought to the fore what was happening. In another way, it risked amplifying the narrative further. So that was something that we kept our eye on. And if I'm honest, there wasn't much required from us after that point in terms of direct interventions. The exposure, so the amplification sort of spiked briefly after the Times article, but then it pitted out. If it became something of an enduring narrative, we may have felt the need to step in, but at that point we didn't. But I think it just shows, even with the tool set that you look at, so specifically exposing something, the risks you run in terms of actually amplifying further and facilitating your competitors' objectives, I suppose you could put it in that way.
Thank you. Now I would turn to both of you for a kind of a broader question, and both of the strategies that you talked about require some sort of understanding of the environment where you operate. So requirement for data which gives you an understanding in what terrain you operate, what might be effective, whom to target, etc., etc. If you had a right or possibility to choose which data you would say are absolutely essential to be able to communicate in this environment, and which data would be very important to have, so that to give the others an idea of what they might be still have to look for, what are the things that are really essential to develop that campaign. Morgan, let's start with you.
Yeah, I would say accurate understanding of how the trust in each other is, and secondly, the trust in institutions. In that order, I would say.
John?
I was going to say trust as well, so Morgan stole my sandwiches a little bit there, but I can say another piece of data that we look at. So luckily my portfolio is a bit narrower than Morgan's, so if I'm looking at state disinformation, what I really want to know is actually what is the policy or strategic communication objective of that state on this issue. That then allows me to think, well, actually, I understand their rationale and I can potentially preempt or predict what may come in the future, and that enables me to get my counter disinformation activity set up and ready to go, as opposed to being purely responsive. So understanding a competitor's intent would be what I would follow up with. But I would caveat that's after trust. I very much agree with Morgan. Trust is what it's about.
Well, it is, and it's hard to come about, I think, these days. Well, of course, Sweden stands apart from most of the governments, but when I look throughout Europe, the key trend is there's less and less trust in central government throughout the societies, and I think that's been part of the communication problem that has to be overcome. And actually, that would be probably my next question. If there is a low level of trust in the government, how do you go about it? How do you try to create the effective communication in these circumstances?
That is a very long-term project, I would say. Trust is very hard to change unless it's falling. That is very simple to arrange. But I would say the most important thing is trust in healthcare system, in the people who work in healthcare. And we have some worrying figures in Sweden, where it turns out that in some parts of Sweden, quite a few of the people working in healthcare actually say that they will not take the vaccine. And that is problematic, because they are the most important ambassadors when it comes to vaccination generally, in order to straighten out the facts. We were talking about science, and you can argue that science on the most simple level is meeting a doctor or a nurse who can explain to you why you should take the vaccine. And if they themselves are not taking the vaccine, it will be very hard to persuade people, other people who hesitate.
John?
So yeah, trust again. So I think we've seen trends over the last few years in terms of an increased, I think, localization of trust, I think you can say, in terms of people turning to either their immediate communities, be it on social media or otherwise, and actually increasing the trust in them as opposed to government actors. I think a good example of something that's bucked the trend or resisted it a little bit is scientists to some degree. So in terms of relative levels of trust, scientists are still trusted more than government officials. So in terms of messaging on this issue, it's sometimes advantageous to put the scientists front and center. I know that there's been a recent campaign, a pro-vaccination or pro-COVID behavior campaign from Professor Chris Whitty, who is effectively the face of UK science on this issue. And that's had some positive effects because he's someone that a relationship has been built up with over last year. He's talked in a calm, considered manner, and he's relatively trusted. But fundamentally, it's because he sits in that science bucket as opposed to government official bucket. I think we have to start from the point of view that if you're working for the government, you're at a low level of trust in the public's eyes, be it right or wrong.
Well, so I think you both allude that there are some, well, although there's probably not so much trust in the central government, there are always some entities that people are going to trust, and they might lie in areas like medical system or science. But with the science, I have a specific question, because I think we've been grappling for that for quite some time relative to disinformation. Science has been harder and harder to communicate because science is complex, it is difficult, it doesn't have a very direct answers, like in the case with COVID. There are many unknowns. And in the current contemporary information environment, everything is opposite. It's very simplistic, very emotional, very direct. How do we make science communicate and be heard in this new information environment? John? Okay,
it's a tricky ask. I mean, there are some sort of core principles when communicating that you can go by. So we start off with the source itself. So I think that example of Professor Chris Whitty was a good one. So you start there. So the source is credible. In terms of the manner in which he speaks, it's quite simple and it is clear. And he boils it down to the sort of the simple as it can be, but no more. And there's repetition there. So repetition, not just within a specific speech or content, but also across all different mediums, the similar key messages are trying to be pushed, whatever channel or medium you choose. I think I'm going to build on a point Morgan made earlier in terms of storytelling and actually being emotive in the way you do things, in terms of, and also giving people a sense of agency when you're explaining this science. So it's about if you are compliant with these rules, if you wear a mask, if you conduct yourself in the right way, it will help improve your life in the long run. You will be able to get out of these lockdown measures, etc. So there are quite a few different things you can do there, I would say, as a starting point. But fundamentally, it is tricky because the science is complex. And again, I'll sort of jump on one of Morgan's points. You have to accept and be comfortable with the unknowns and letting people know that there are unknowns out there, but in a manner that is positive. So you're not necessarily talking about the risk, you're talking about the increased level of safety. So how you frame the science as well is also really important.
Before I go to Morgan, I add on a kind of extra element to my question from the audience, and that is that disinformation leverages unconscious thought processes. On the other hand, scientific information requires a cognitive effort. So is that chronically imbalanced fight that we're fighting here?
Again, that's a tricky one. I think, yes, that is certainly a disadvantage. I think what you can start talking about there is the advantages that a particular source will have. So if we go back to the Chris Whitty example, that is a relationship that has been built up over time with the audiences. So that is a strength that that source has. But yes, I do understand the angle that the disinformation is not constrained by fact and therefore can be more creative and appealing, or at least clickbait-esque. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I don't have a great answer to it.
Morgan, probably you have a great answer and a silver bullet.
Well, I'm not sure I have a great answer. I think we need to understand that people who have doubts should not be ridiculed, and science sometimes science and fact can be perceived like it is that we actually are well, telling people that they are stupid, and I think that is very, very tricky. So if you have an emotional argument, it is difficult to win that battle with a rational argument the other way around. So I think one has to start with storytelling and to be very close to the person. I mean, sitting there with the doctor you trust and hearing him both have emotional and rational arguments. I think that's the way to go. And I'm thinking one way is to be persistent and to be coordinated. And that means that many actors need to not have exactly the same story, of course, because that would make us be Soviet Union or propaganda, but to have the same lines and methods. We, for instance, and I'm sure you also have toolboxes that we have, MSB has put forward and released a few years ago. And the meaning with them is that every actor will be able to work the same way, and that is to streamline things so people can understand both when taking action and receiving the information. But I think also that we need to think about how to bring out the emotional arguments to people who themselves are emotional about things, and I can understand that. To put a vaccine in your body, it is infringing on your freedom unless you feel that you have decided to do that on totally on your own, that it is your own decision. So I think we have to be persistent, coordinated, and to accept the fact that emotional arguments need to be out there as well.
Well, absolutely. I think what we've seen is actually emotions are at this point in time the most powerful means of communication, and I actually quite I like the idea of Morgan that you have to put more storytelling into the science. I've actually just come up with an idea that for the science papers next to the kind of actual paper that has been peer reviewed, you not only have synopsis of it, but also a story that to be told by this new research that has been done. Because I agree, and I think I've repeated it a number of times, that science has went up onto the ivory tower, and it is hard for them to get back to us ordinary people, and that would be good to lose a little bit of that, if I may put it that way, arrogance. And as you said, be more able to relate, because of course not to simplify research in itself, but remember that it has to ultimately be explained to the humans. If not, humans will take a different path, and that will be bad for everyone. Now, I have a kind of also a follow-up question to some of these discussions we've had, and that is about audiences. Of course, well, in a perfect world, we talk to everyone, with everyone, and etc., etc. But on delivering this information about vaccines, the vaccination process, the effects of the vaccine, and etc., etc., what do you think, and how do you think about the audiences? Which you would think of the primary audiences, priority audiences, because also. It's not the Eurobarometer is not drilling very much into the substance, but clearly there are group of people that are ready to go immediately. There are people that are more relaxed but ready to go once it is possible. There are the ones that will say, "I'll wait and see how it goes," and then there are quite a also sizable group of those saying, "Never ever." How do you? Which ones you choose? Is there more an age factor into it? What are these factors, Morgan?
Well, I would start with the health workers or people taking care of elderly people. and to get them to become ambassadors, because I think that conversation and a person, an elderly person who sits with his or her caretaker and gets the arguments, that will prove decisive. And that is, if I had to pick one audience, that would be it. So indirectly, of course, the general public, but through health workers and others in public domain who meets people. But that is when you come down to the arguments, when you sit there with the details. I would argue as well that you need a broader approach, which would be directed towards the general public, because and that would not be about the specific vaccines themselves, but that would be about the broader questions, how science works. Not that we would explain science, but underlying message would be that, and also actually how democracy works. That it is not an end in itself; it is a mean towards something. But I mean, we are in the midst of vaccination now, so this might not be the time to do that. But these two things, these two audiences approach the way I said, I think that would be one way of addressing this problem.
Thank you, John.
I suppose 3 points on that. Again, I concur with Morgan, but just for debates and different perspectives, I think we have to be very specific about the objectives. So we're assuming this is about vaccine hesitancy and decreasing vaccine hesitancy. So as a sort of top line, I'd be, well, actually, who are the influences of the hesitance? And there's some interesting data that suggests vaccine hesitant people are more likely to use non-traditional media to get their information on the pandemic. So you could potentially define your priority audiences by the media they consume. So that could be one way that you approach the problem. I think there's another way you could sort of slice it in terms of prioritization intent, and we've touched upon it a little bit in terms of acknowledging that there are different types of hesitancy, from the pregnant mother that's worried about injecting something into her body to someone that's anti-establishment and will never trust anything the government says or does. And it's a spectrum. Well, who within that spectrum are the persuadables? Who are the swing? Who are the people you should devote effort to increase or decrease vaccine hesitancy by the greatest amount? And I think you have to think about it in that way, because resources are limited and you have to direct them where there's going to be the most gain or most positive outcome.
Now that we've talked about different actors that have been addressing the problem or pushing the problem of the disinformation or misinformation related to vaccines, and we've established there are societal groups or individuals and the countries, but there is also a kind of sort of organized network of anti-vaxxer movement that is quite active in promoting specific ideas about vaccination, like Informed Consent Action Network, National Vaccine Information Center, that actually organize conferences and develop playbooks of their own, how to talk about anti-vaccination during these times, how to persuade people, what are the arguments to be used, etc., etc. What do you think, and how would you address the actors like that? Morgan?
But it is very difficult. I think I would hope in my old trade that journalists would debunk them. I think it's very hard for us to get out there and question them. As I said, we see them as well, not the actors, but whom they address, worried citizens, and we have to address them. Actually, Swedish television, my old employer, they had a three-part documentary on anti-vax, and which came out just by coincidence just recently, and I think that is the best way of they had been following both in the States and in Sweden anti-vaxxers, and that's the best way of showing them, especially the third episode, which almost made me, thinking of democracy, where suddenly one of the more outspoken people from the anti-vaxxers suddenly started talking about the Jewish conspiracy, which you started off with, and that sort of like concludes the circle. I think we need others to show them for what they really are, and that is very difficult for us being authorities, the government, to do that, to get into that debate.
John?
Yeah. So I think what's sometimes useful here is to adopt I think of a better word, but an adversarial mindset. You have to acknowledge that there's a competitor here for people's opinions and beliefs, and you have to think about your comms in that way. So you have to make your own communications more resilient, but then you have to think about, well, what are the objectives of this disinformation organization? Who are their likely audiences going to be? What sort of strategies are they going to employ? And how can I deliver content or information to the people that they're targeting that will persuade them to my cause and actually truthful and robust facts, as opposed to the disinformation that they're trying to peddle? Morgan again touched upon it, but I think a problem here is just sort of mass, the sheer quantity of it that's out there. So it can't be necessarily centralized as a government action, and it requires some sort of input from civil society. So how can we as governments empower civil societies to actually fight this battle? And I think that's really what it is on our behalf. Can we inform them? Can we provide them, can we convene experts to provide knowledge and actually approaches and suggestions? But it's almost like rallying as many people to your side as possible and then just sending them in a direction.
Well, if I may share my observation, I think on that part, society is deeply divided. And there are part of the society that is in one camp, and it's very hard to persuade them otherwise, and then the other side. So civic society is not, one coherent unit. They are on this specific issue, I think, very much divided. Obviously, I hope the facts and figures and science would have their effect over a longer period of time. But, well, it takes time, and the problem is right now. If I may, now I have a series of questions that relate to kind of some of the strategies, and I'll try to combine some of them. So, raising awareness campaign, is it strategically effective enough when the threat to society from this disinformation at this particular point in time is so high, actually literally costing lives? Are coercive measures necessary at one point? And an add-on to that, to what extent will regulations affect the uptake of vaccine, like the ones where I've seen some airlines have declared that vaccine will be required to onboard their plane, or some countries, at least in the media, there's been a news they will require a vaccine to be allowed to enter this particular country. How do you think? Do we really have to be more coercive? Do we have to use more regulation? Or it's just this making people decide on themselves and hoping they will be guided by science and facts? Morgan?
Well, I don't think it's either or. I think one should use the arguments I said, the emotional arguments. I'm not sure that it is a great parallel, but it is a bit like fighting a fire in the forest. Are you going to concentrate on the trees that are already burning, or would you like to stop the spread? And I mean, to be honest, the forest is on fire, so we need to stop the spread. And I think that we have to debunk it by actually using the emotional arguments as well. I'm coming back to that because I think that is the viable way to do this. And that is not to only have the science with you, but actually talk about and say that this is not only for you, but it is for the greater good of society. And as I said, for your friend, if you're a young person, for your friend to get that internship or to get that job or come back to classroom. I mean, all these things are so strong arguments for for young people as well as old people to get back to a normal life, that it is not only about the contagion itself. And I think that is the only way of doing this. Unfortunately, much of the narrative is about, I mean, all these figures, how many people are dying. So the narrative is almost only, well, it's very focused on the contagion and how many people are dying. So instead of concentrating on death, I think we should concentrate on life and how to reestablish life in the way that we would like to have it. And say that vaccine is one way of doing that. And we need to keep on washing our hands, by the way, at least for the time being.
Thank you for that reminder, Morgan. John?
Again, I agree with Morgan. I think what's interesting is that's connected to this is something we've observed is that state-sponsored disinformation has often pushed the idea that governments are going to impose mandatory vaccinations, which is not generally the case. So that's a piece of disinformation we've seen be pushed quite aggressively in terms of trying to undermine us as a liberal democracy and what we stand for. But exactly as Morgan said, I don't think this is necessarily an either or. What I would say, though, is that there are some examples of, I wouldn't say coercion, but certainly legislation or direction that you have to comply to a certain degree. So wearing face masks on public transport. Is it coercion? No, but it's dictated and you'll be challenged if you don't, and you may not get access to the transport. So, it's a very fine line, but there are some measures already out there.
Well, thank you. Actually, the very last question from one of our regular observers of this webinars, and the one who is a journalist asking actually to John, mentioning this Time article you spoke about earlier in your talk. Did you suggest this article?
No, I wasn't even working on the project. So no, I don't
fame
think
in that. Okay, well, that was, I think, to ease up the things a little bit. Our time is almost up. I think we've had a interesting conversation showing how complex the issue is. And there are no silver bullets, no simple solutions. And also this vaccination problem is not a one-time solution. It's been here because of the long-term developments we've seen in the information space, with disinformation actors, with the way audiences have been consuming the information. And in that landscape, this vaccination work has become so much more complex. And also, therefore, the solutions are not as straightforward. There are no simple things to do. There are complex things that have to be addressed, and you have to address them based on the whatever baseline you have, the trust in the science in the society, trust in the medical system in the society, trust in the central government in the society, and trust in the truth and the trust in the facts. I think all these things are really the benchmarks from which we start. And there has been a varied positions that countries start. But whatever your position, there has to be an active way to make sure people find the information. They're able to navigate this noise or cacophony of disinformation and misinformation. And we have, I think, very eloquently said by Morgan, but also by John, emotion is that we have to do. Governments are hard-pressed to do the emotional conversation, but this is what communicates to humans. That is what communicates to a human mind. And lastly, but not least, we have to make science arguments more accessible to the general public, because we're increasingly lacking science in the everyday narrative of our societies, and I think it has been put very crystal clear by this COVID situation and also by this vaccination situation. Science has to be back, and science has to be integrated into the normal everyday discussion and has to be understood. And of course, long term, it's about educating our citizens to navigate current information environment, because well, I hope and I believe one time we will win this pandemic. We'll get the vaccination right. We'll get the medicine right. But there'll be new crises. There'll be new problems. And once again, if we've not solved this problem, it will be one of the core issues. With that, thank you, Morgan. Thank you, John. Thank you for those who tuned in and watched this discussion. Next week, we have another webinar. This time we will be focusing on information laundering. Same place, same time, same date. Thank you. Bye.